Dr. Sharada Srinivasan, our other speaker for this evening, is Professor, National Institute of Advanced Studies, NIAS, Bengaluru. She has a BTech from the IIT Bombay and PhD from University College London. She's a Fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and World Academy of Art and Science. She was honored with the Padhmashri by the Government of India in 2019. Her many awards include Dr. Kalpana Chola Young Women Scientist Award for 2011, Indian Institute of Metals Certificate of Excellence 2007, Materials Research Society of India Medal 2006, Multi B. Nagar Ethno-Archaeology Award 2005, first author of India's legendary wood steel, pioneering contributions to the study of archaeology and history of art from the perspective of exploring engineering applications in these disciplines. That's Dr. Sharada's contribution. Her talk for this evening is titled Chola Bronzes, Art, Historical and Archaeometallurgical Insights. She will distill her research on the archaeometallurgical aspects of ancient mining and metallurgy in South India, as well as a nuanced understanding of the iconography of South Indian bronzes. So I'm very much looking forward to the talks.
A very good evening to you all. I'm Professor Sharada Srinivasan from the National Institute of Advanced Studies, and it's a great privilege for me to be here, to be speaking to this erudite audience and through this aegis of the prestigious Tamil Heritage Trust, and congratulations on all your endeavors. And I'm also very pleased to be speaking here with several other eminent experts, Dr. Nagaswamy, Dr. V.S. Ramaswamy, Dr. V.S. Ramachandran, Dr. Levy and others, and also Dr. Chithra, Madhavan, and so on. And I'll be talking about Chola bronzes, some art historical and archaeometallurgical insights through my own journeys in these studies. And so basically, my training has been in the combination of interdisciplinary perspectives of applying scientific techniques in the study of archaeology and so on. And I've worked particularly in ancient mining and metallurgical heritage. And as you can see here, of course, you have spectacular Nataraja bronze, but also a view of an old copper working in Agni Gundala in Andhra Pradesh. And you can see the malachite stains where the copper has been worked out. And so this is some of the background of old mining and so on. And some of my experience as a dancer is also in a way enlivened my, at least enriched my personal study and approach of these bronzes. Well, the Chola bronzes, of course, need no introduction to this audience, but you're looking here at the two of the metal icons, which are the only ones which now survive in the colossal Brihadishvara temple of the 11th century in Thanjavur, built by Rajaraja Cholan. And according to inscription, there were about 60 metal icons. And Adavalan or Nataraja, Shiva as the Lord of Dance, was the Kula Devata or the family deity of the Cholas. And these icons were cast as processional images or Utsava Murtis to be taken out during procession, whereas the main icon in the Garbhagriha or the Sanctum Sanctorum, of course, is the Shivalingam, the aniconic Shivalingam. And South Indian inscriptions generally describe South Indian bronzes as Cheppu Theramani, according to various scholars like Nagaswamy, images of the Lord. And of course, other scholars such as Job Thomas and so on have pointed out that perhaps all of these 60 icons were not really that colossal. They may have varied very greatly in size. And he also pointed to, the enormous resources that would have gone into actually maintaining these icons, which were deified, of course, but also they had to be fed and clothed and looked after in a very anthropomorphic sort of way. So my journey into the study of these icons really was trying to understand how the study of the metal technology would help to resolve some of the questions related to the stylistic characterization and the attributions and so on. And of course, these being deities, they were not necessarily inscribed. A lot more Buddhist bronzes, for example, have donor inscriptions, but very few Hindu images actually had donor inscriptions and such like, because of course they were intended to be worshipped as deities. And some of the investigations that I will be touching upon explored how one could use metallurgical analysis to characterize some of these bronzes. And here you're looking at a beautiful Nataraja image, which is in the Government Museum, Chennai, from Velankani, which other scholars such as P.R. Srinivasan also attributed to Rajaraja Cholan. And this I had also fingerprinted to this period. And you can see that it does have some stylistic similarities here, for example, with the stone Nataraja, which is in the Brihadishwara temple. And here you also see, of course, that he's accompanied by the Tamil poet Saint Karaikalamayar in one corner, who's playing the cymbals. And of course, the icon of Shiva as Nataraja is also always invariably accompanied by the consort or Shivakami. And this is a very spectacular occasion where he's been decorated very greatly on a festive occasion. Well, one of the very renowned patrons of Chola bronzes was the widowed Dowager Queen Sembian Mahadevi, under whom the Nataraja image also came more widely into vogue. And for example, you're looking at a sculpture in the Adithurai temple built by Sembian Mahadevi in the earlier half of the 10th century. And that is one of the early visualizations of the Nataraja image in stone. And you're also seeing on the far side the Nataraja bronze in the Adithurai temple, which is very beautifully depicted in a very ascetic way with the Rudraksha Mala and the attire and so on. And that is, of course, one of the processional images which is still in the temple. And you're also looking at a beautiful image in the Freer Gallery of Art, which has been thought to represent the Chola Queen Sembian Mahadevi. And there was also a town named after her. And according to inscription, deified images of her were taken out in procession on her natal star. And there is also, for example, an inscription of Rajendra, which mentions offerings to her image. And I also put in this sculpture of the stone Nataraja in Gangaikonda Chorapuram to also point out to you that, in a way, the metal icon of Nataraja is something which really lends itself, this form really best lends itself to the material of metal, because as you can see with stone, the leg below has a strut which is propping it up, because stone does not have very good tensile strength, whereas it is really in bronze that the image really seems to come into its more authoritative manifestation. And you can also see here that this is a beautiful image of Nataraja from Kankodu Vanithavam in the Madras Museum. And this I had been able to analyze using inductively coupled plasma optical emission spectroscopy, and found that it had 8% tin and 8% lead. So it's a leaded bronze. And you can see that the image falls within the sacred geometry of two superposed triangles, the Satkuna, and also the way in which the Prabhavali itself was forming a part of the design to enable the more effective casting of the metal. For instance, the snake has a runner which connects it to the Prabhavali. You would have already seen quite a lot on the metal castings, so in the previous talk. So to that extent, you would be more familiar. And of course, this image also came to global attention through the writings of Ananda Kumaraswamy, the celebrated geologist turned art historian, who wrote of the Panchakritya, or the 5 activities of Shiva from 13th century Shaiva Siddhantic texts, where he balances Srishti, which is creation as epitomized by the drum, with Samhara or destruction as signified by the fire, and the hand is an Abhaya Mudra, and the perpetual cycles are depicted by the Prabhavali, and he dances on the dwarf demon Apaswara or Muralagan. And it's a very beautiful conception also, which Kumaraswamy also described as poetry, but nonetheless science. And coming to the technology of the casting of the images, we do get some insights already in the inscriptions and the way the images are categorized. And you're looking here at some very renowned masterpieces of Chola bronzes. There is the Shiva as Rishabha Vahana in the pastoral form with consort Parvati, which is now in the Thanjavur Art Gallery. And as you can see, all of these images have the holes for taking the images out in procession. And there is also an image in the center that you can see of Rishabha Vahana Deva and the consort from the Natanapurishwara temple in Tandantotam, which is also dated to the Aditya Chola school in the early to mid 10th century. And here you see that the bull, which is next to the Vahana, or the bull which is next to Shiva as Rishabha Vahana, you can see that the leg is rather cracked in many places. And there is also a Chola inscription which mentions that the Deva or deity should be Ganamaga, which is solid, and the Rishabha or bull is Chedya or hollow. So there were these 2 different methods of casting which were being followed, where the main image is solid because that was considered more auspicious. But some of the vahanas and the accessories and so on could be hollow cast. And as you can make out here, the hollow casting technique was one where there is an inner clay core and then a thinner layer of metal built onto it. And so that when the wax model is covered with numerous layers of clay and the wax is melted out, it is a thin layer of metal which actually forms. And of course, these images of Rishabha Vahana in the Thanjavur Art Gallery have also been correlated to inscriptions in the Shvetaranyeshwara temple in Thiruvengaru, which suggests that such a set of images were donated in 1011 and 1012 AD in the period of Rajaraja. And here is, of course, the masterpiece of Ardhanarishwara, which represents the unity between the male and female principles of Purusha and Prakriti. And here you can also see how, in a way, these images have come together. The Rishabha Vahana and consort are very beautifully, in a way, conjoined, and you can see this Ardhanarishwara image. And in many of the stone sculptures also, of course, Ardhanarishwara also has the bull accompanying the image. So, well, I won't go too much into the metal casting process, which you would have had a lot that you would have already heard of. But coming back here, since my own fieldwork in my PhD thesis took me to the celebrated workshop of the Devasena Sthapati family going back to 1990. And you can see here how the solid image is being fashioned of Shiva Nataraja using the odiole or the palm fronds for measuring out the proportions. And you can also see the different layers of wax, the different layers of clay which have been added on to the wax model to make the mold. And the runners have also been fashioned here in the wax model. So the runners are what facilitate the pouring of the metal more freely, because metal tends to be rather viscous. And there is also the description, which is rather lovely, of the mold itself as karu, or the womb, because it gives the sense of a birthing process. And then the mold is covered with cow dung and so on, and heated so that the wax is melted out, and then the metal is poured into the mold. And the talamana cannon was also used to mark out the proportions of the icon, and in the modeling of the icon. And there's also a lovely verse which is attributed to Andal, the 9th century woman saint, who was also a devotee of Shiva in the Nachiyar Tirumuri, where she says, "Ulle ulle meriguruki venkalamutra vari seivadu pol marayai unakku," where she compares the release of wax from the mold to the process of rain from the clouds. So it's a very beautiful and evocative metaphor, implying that there's also a metaphysical connotation to the lost wax casting process. And here you're seeing, of course, the metal has been melted, and the mold, once it has been de-waxed, has been buried into the earth, and then the molten metal poured in. And it's also interesting that some of the technicalities which have been described in the treatises, such as the Manasollasa by the Chalukyan king Someshwara of the 12th century, you can also see some of these persisting in the traditional practices, of course, not only in the layers of clay that are applied to the mold, but you see here Swaminathan Stapati is actually holding this wick, which is lighted at the mouth of the crucible. And that is also mentioned in the Manasollasa and the various translations reported by various scholars, such as Saraswati and Reeves and so on. And there's a function to this, because it ensures that a reducing condition is maintained as the metal is being poured, because otherwise what would happen is that a very thick fire skin would form, and it would not be such a good casting. And of course, also put in here a slide with Radhakrishna Stapati going back to 1990, my first visits there. But it's also interesting that during that visit, Devasena Stapati, who was still alive, also mentioned to me that there are differences between the casting procedures followed today from what was done in antiquity. And he told me that in the past, the image, you see, as you can see in the top here, the mold has the orifice which is facing upwards, so that the metal flows down in this fashion. Whereas in the past, he said that the pouring was done such that there was more than one sprue, so that it was more of a gentle incline. And you can make that out when you look at several of the old bronzes, such as this Nilapadi Krishna, which I had also analyzed, and it was also technically fingerprinted, as I'll explain that process, to the Vijayanagara period. And you can see there the runners, which have, it's an unfinished image, and the runners, you can imagine how it would have been lying, so that the pouring would have been done from the back of the image. So some of my early work through my doctoral research, and then ongoing work as well, but a lot of it done in that rather intense phase, was of doing the compositional analysis of South Indian metal icons. And I was able to get access to some of the real masterpieces of images in the Chennai Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum and British Museum and so on, and sampled and studied them using fairly non-invasive techniques of just microsampling and things like that. And these were analyzed for about 18 elements. And it was found that about 80% of the South Indian images of different periods were leaded bronzes, and the rest were leaded brasses. So leaded bronze are typically, of course, tin makes copper more cast. The addition of lead improves the castability of bronze. And you're looking up at the top corner at a microstructure of a cast Chola piece. And at the bottom is a Chera image of the 16th century from the CSVMS Museum, which I had collaborated in a study many years ago with the BRC, where we did in situ metallography. And that is actually more of a brass, which is an alloy with zinc and lead, as it were. And I was also able to find that there were certain compositional differences in terms of not the major elements which are intentionally alloyed, which means that when you add lead, tin, and zinc, those are major elements which are intentionally alloyed. But there was some clustering in terms of the trace elements, particularly nickel, cobalt, antimony, bismuth, and which I think is a bit significant, and arsenic as well, which I think is significant in terms of being related to the copper sources, because different copper sources would have been used over different periods of time, or so it would seem. And there are also some, of course, differences in the major element compositions. For instance, the Chola pieces had much more of tin in them than the later images, which start using zinc, and they're more brassy, as it were. But one thing, of course, the description of the Chola bronzes as Panchaloha, that I think is more symbolic than literal, really, because there's no marked 5 metals which are alloyed. And of course, you wouldn't really get in practical terms a proper alloy as well if you added too much of 5 different metals in that sense. So, but as Devasena Sthapati had told me in that early visit itself, that the Panchaloha prescription referred more to the addition of very minor traces of gold or silver, more as a shastra. Now, I'll just move on quickly to some more of the technicalities before coming to the art historical significance of some of the studies. So one of the techniques that I was able to use in the characterization of these bronzes was lead isotope ratio analysis, which is a very useful fingerprinting technique, because the lead isotope ratios of leaded artifacts tend to vary discretely according to the source of lead, because lead in particular, due to some factors of the geochemistry, has this property that the isotopic ratios vary from ore deposit to ore deposit because of the geochemistry of the uranium thorium cycle and so on. And so what that basically means is that if lead from different sources was being used at different periods of time, then those would tend to cluster together based on the source of lead. And of course, for this, you need to have a lot of extensive data on the lead isotope ratios of the primary ore deposits, which we may not always have in terms of the Indian material. But for instance, here you get some indications. There was one bronze, which is a Ganesha image from Nellore of the 18th century Maratha period. And the lead isotope ratios of that closely matched the Dariba mine in Rajasthan. So you could imagine, of course, that by the Maratha period, they were using Western Indian sources. And likewise, there was an inscribed Buddha from Kanchipuram, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, of about the 13th century, which matched the Ambaji mine, which is in Gujarat. And that is actually found to be a brass image with 21% zinc. Now, it's also, of course, well known that the Western Indian region of Zawar was where the mining of zinc, the extractive metallurgy of zinc, came into vogue for the first time, and there are extensive retorts and so on related to zinc smelting. I won't go into all of that, except to say that in this case, of course, the zinc here, the 21% zinc in this image, the lead isotope ratios certainly don't match ours, so there may have been another source of zinc. Though, of course, it need not have been metallic zinc, but there is other ways of making brass with a lower amount of zinc, which is the cementation brass and so on. But what was also interesting was that the lead isotope ratios of this Deccan zinc ingot, which had a Deccan Brahmi inscription, which is one of the very early examples of metallic zinc which are known, that did not actually fit the lead isotope ratios of Zawar, but it did cluster together with this set of South Indian bronze images. So what I've done is, of course, for the majority of South Indian bronzes, one couldn't really identify the lead isotope ratios so easily, but the fact is that they tend to cluster together, and when you actually explode that region over there, and you find that there are these smaller clusters, and those smaller clusters are actually quite meaningful because they tend to show some stylistic coherence in terms of the artifacts fitting those ellipses and so on. And so, for example, the lead isotope ratios of the Chola or the high Chola period, which fall into the ellipse 1A in this case, are significantly different from the ellipse 2A, which correlates more to the bronzes from the Vijayanagara period and so on. So using this, even within these smaller clusters, there is some stylistic coherence based on which it was possible to reassess some of the dates of the images. And this was taken along with the data from the trace element analysis so that one could generate these profiles for different periods of bronzes and so on, moving from the early Andhra Pallava to the high Chola or Vijayalaya Chola as we call it, and then the late Chola or Chalukya Chola as it's sometimes described, and then later Pandya and Vijayanagara and so on. So I'll just move on now to some of the images. I've published a lot about all this so people could go into more of the details, but I wanted to spend some time looking also at the significance in terms of some of the reassessments and style and so on. So one of the images which was studied was this Senian Viruthi Kali from the Chennai Museum with the paleographic inscription of the 10th century. And that is also corroborated to as early Chola. And likewise, this Nishumbasudani, which is also attributed to the period of Aditya Chola. And there is also the mention of the worship of Nishumbasudani. And this is a very, also very lively image, which shows, she's holding a cock and a bell, and very dynamic, again, showing a lot of, attention to movements derived from the dance tradition and so on. And also the hair standing up and is rather similar in this group of Kali bronzes at the time. And amongst the well-known dated Chola bronzes, there is a very fine piece which is from the Karaiviram temple of Shivakami, and there is a pedestal inscription which is dated to 917 AD, and it mentions the Parantaka Chola and Uma Bhattaraki. Of course, I couldn't sample this image, but I would say that one of the images that I had studied, the Somaskanda from Nidur of the Government Museum Chennai, which had 12% tin, that was found to fit this group of the high Chola pieces that I was talking about. And there was also something which was quite interesting, though the significance has to be understood a bit more. Even within that 1A ellipse, it was seen that the early Chola pieces clustered to the bottom of the ellipse, and the slightly later Vijayala Chola, the later Imperial Chola, tend to move up on that ellipse. And so the significance is that in the earlier periods, the mining would have been from the top, and as you go deeper, the lead isotope ratios actually increase because the age of the deposit increases and so on. So there are some connections there as well, of which has to be unpacked perhaps a bit more with more concerted studies. So I'm also pointing here to some images. Again, there is a sampled Parvati from Vengimalai, which also fitted the high Chola group. And I won't go into this too much, but there is, as I said, a marked separation from bronzes which are attributed to the Vijayanagara period and the later Chalukya Chola period, as it were. And for example, you're looking at this Rama image from Thiruvelangadu of the 13th century, which was fingerprinted to the later Chola period or Chalukya Chola period. And another interesting thing is that, and that had very different fingerprints from the Vijayanagara pieces, which were, one of them is a Rama in the Victorian and Albert Museum of the 15th century, which was found to be a brass of 21% zinc. So it seems that that ellipse 2A into which that image falls, that is also a lead zinc source, but it seems to be a discrete source there, though we don't actually yet have the data to figure out which sources those were. And another interesting aspect was that between this Chalukya Chola to the Vijayanagara period, there is also a shift in the iconometric modeling of the Rama image, because in this later Chalukya Chola period piece, there is a move from the Ashtatala to the Dashatala, which is what you're seeing in the Rama image from the Victor and Albert Museum. And so the Ashtatala is also often associated with an idealized man, whereas Dashatala is more associated with the major deities like Vishnu and so on. So it almost seems as if, there is a further elevation in terms of the significance of Rama worship. Maybe earlier it is more in the form of a divine prince, whereas then by the Vijayanagara era, he becomes a major deity. And of course, you also see the worship of Rama with a discrete temple, which is only dedicated to Rama worship in the Ramachandra temple in Hampi, which is attributed to Devaraya and so on. And here, I also wanted to mention that, of course, the question may be posed as to where were the sources of metal. And of course, this is a work in progress, which needs a lot more concerted and systematic study. But there is a site which is not far from the Vijayanagara capital of Hampi, which is Tintini, where there are a lot of mineral-rich geological formations and so on. And of course, as you can see in Hampi, the temples are themselves embedded within these porphyritic granites and so on. And there are these wash tanks on top of the hilltop of Tintini, where the ore crushing and the ore segregation and ore washing was done to remove the heavier metal from the lighter gang and so on. And so one had done some microscopy and also electron probe microanalysis on the slag specimens or the metallurgical waste or debris. The slag is typically formed during the smelting process, where the metal tends to float down and the slag tends to float to the top of the furnace. And that tends to trap the remnants of copper and so on. And these remnants were found to have a similar nickel-cobalt ratio profile to the Vijayanagara bronzes, which were tending to cluster in that way. And that could be meaningful in terms of that being a possible copper source. And now coming to some of the other findings here. So I was also able to identify some Vishnu images, which were could be characterized as Pallava. And you're seeing here also a radiograph of a Pallava image, which shows you that it is a solid cast image. And very interestingly, the two images which were gilded, one is a Nagapattinam gilt Buddha, and the other one, which is a very celebrated Sri Lankan bronze of Tara or Patini Devi, as she's described, found near Batikoloa. The two of those gilt bronzes had very similar lead-isotope ratios in just falling, and of course the Nagapattinam Buddha was also fitting the trace element trends for the later Chalukya Chola period bronzes. Of course, I wasn't able to do the trace element and compositional analysis of the Tara, but there certainly seems to be a connection there between these two Buddhist bronzes. And so perhaps there is a connection in terms of a Tamil source of metal. So these are again further things to be examined. And this Nagapattinam Buddha also shows certain syncretic elements with Hindu modes of worship, so to speak, because it has these holes indicating that it was being taken out for processional worship and so on. And of course, just to also point out that you can also see the influence of the Gupta style of making the Sultanganj Buddha in this image with this robe. And that image, though, the celebrated Sultanganj Buddha in the Birmingham Museum of the late Gupta period, that is found to be a copper image. It is a study not done by me, but by other researchers. And it's also a hollow cast bronze, which is different from what we're seeing here in these solid cast images. And that hollow casting technique, which you also see in this Avalokiteshvara from Krishna Delta, so that traces back to the Hellenistic mode of hollow casting. And of course, that hollow cast Avalokiteshvara also fitted the profile for the early pre-Pallava group of bronzes, so to speak. So one of the very important findings from my study, at least in terms of the art historical significance, was of the identification of some bronzes which were dated as Chola because they represent the typical image of the dancing Shiva that we associated with the Chola period. But in fact, they found from the metallurgical profile to better fit the Pallava attribution. And when you go back and look at some of these images again, it does appear that these would actually be better characterized as Pallava. And you're looking here at this Nataraja in the British Museum, which is one such example. And of course, one reason why it has been thought that the Nataraja bronze developed in the Chola period particularly is because, of course, we haven't found many inscribed bronzes also of the Pallava period. But there are depictions of the leg extended in what we call the Bhujanga Trasita Karana also in the Pallava period. For example, in Siyamangalam, you have a pilaster representation of the 7th century where the leg is typically lifted in Bhujanga Trasita Karana, and you see even the serpent below it, which is related to the issue of serpent fright. And this Siyamangalam Nataraja also, of course, owes something to the Badami 6th century Chalukya Natasha that you're looking at below, in terms of the, the person sitting and playing a drum. You can see something of that echoing in this very small representation of the Siyamangalam Nataraja. And so this image from Kuram, the Natasha from Kuram, of course, which is in the Urdhva Janu pose, also fitted the Pallava fingerprints. And Kuram is also associated with Pallava era copper plates. And you see this Nataraja from the British Museum actually has a lot of similarities there in terms of the Kati Sutra or the sashes and the forward-facing dwarf. But the leg is, of course, lifted in the Bhujanga Trasita. And you're also seeing here another beautiful image of the Pallava period, the Nallur Natasha, which is published by Nagaswamy, where again it is an Urdhva Janu pose, but he's dancing on top of a forward-facing dwarf again. And again, you see in Kailasanatha Swami temple this very marked representation of the sashes or the Kati Sutra. Well, one of the other interesting aspects was that coming to the later periods, of course, Chidambaram is the temple which is really best associated with the worship of the Nataraja bronze. And it is probably the only temple where the anthropomorphic form of the dancing Shiva is actually worshipped in the inner sanctum. And it is also one of the sites which is associated with the Akasha Lingam, one of the 5 elements or formless ether. And you also see the ceiling paintings here, for instance, with the Nataraja image. And the image that you're looking at from Mela Perumalam, which was analyzed by me. Now that had trace element trends and so on, which actually fitted the later Chalukya Chola period, as I would call it. It did not actually fit the earlier imperial Chola period dating, although it was actually attributed to the 10th century by the museum. And in fact, if you look back at it, there are some features of it which fit better with this later Chola period. For instance, the way the Ganas are depicted. You also see that in some other bronzes of that period, such as there is also a Bhikshatana from Mela Perumalam, which has a similar depiction. And another interesting aspect there is that the hairstyle is not actually the flying locks that you're seeing, but it is falling down to the side, and the hair is also there on one side to the bun, like a bun. So it is, and they have it has also been suggested by some scholars such as Benink and Kandan Raja and so on, that at Chidambaram, what was also worshipped is the depiction of Shiva Nataraja in the Shanti Kutu, which is actually the dance which is towards the end of the dance of Ananda Tandava. And the depiction that we really know better, which is Ananda Tandava, which is the hair flying very dramatically, the flying locks, which is described more as the dance of furious bliss, so to speak, which is a balance of, Ananda, which is bliss, and the Tandava, which is more the destructive dance. So that is depicted with the hair flying, as you see in this image of Nataraja from Kankodu Vanithavam, which I had been able to fingerprint to the earlier part of the 11th century, and that was found to have 8% tin and 8% lead. So it seems that the Ananda Tandava is more typically associated with the beginning of the dance of Shiva at Chidambaram Mithilai, and the Shanti Kutu is towards the end, and this is perhaps a depiction of that. And of course, one is also reminded from the dating of the Nataraja bronze to the 9th century of the very beautiful verses, for example, of Manikavachakar, where he talks of Adiyum Antamam Illadavar, the one who is without beginning or end. And he sings in praise of the dancer or Kutan who sports, creating, destroying this heaven and earth and all else. So this sense of connection with the elements and the cosmos, the connection of the human and the cosmic and the divine, some of these seem to all come in with the devotional poetry and also with some of these traditions of worship. And now, of course, as we are progressing into the month of Margari, one should also mention that there is also the tradition of the Arudra Tandava Darshanam at Chidambaram in the month of Margari, which is in December. And what you're looking at here is actually a leaf from a book by Chokalingam, which shows the Orion constellation with stars around it. And it's also thought that the visualization of the Arudra Tandava Darshanam coincides with the appearance of the Orion constellation in the zenith of the Chidambaram temple in the month of December. And here again, it's the Ananda Tandava version, though, that you're seeing with the flying locks, the Virindisade, as the craftspeople would call it. And some years back, I had gotten to a collaboration with the late astrophysicist, Dr. Nirupama Raghavan, who had independently done some work, of course, on the large panels in the Kailasnatha temple of the 7th century on the Pallava stone sculpture of Gangadhara and so on. And she had mapped the star positions of the Orion constellation of that epoch. And she felt that those actually, with the belt aligning along the waist of the Shiva image, that was related to this visualization of the iconography of Shiva Nataraja, of Shiva with respect to Orion. So since we had gotten to this collaboration and I had given her this bronze that I had fingerprinted to about 800 CE of the Nataraja image, and she had she was able to do the star chart plotting for that particular period. And it's also interesting that you see that, of course, the star Betelgeuse falls on the shoulder, Arudra, the red giant, and the lifted leg seems to point towards Sirius, which is Mrigavyada. And so that's also quite interesting in a way, because Sirius also was at some point related with the worship of Shiva, and of course the dog star, as it is called, and so on. There's also another of those depictions at the Kailasnatha temple with the dog depiction and so on. And so, and below the Nataraja image also you see the constellation, or rather Muyalakan. The term Muyalakan itself refers to the hair, and that is the same as the Greek term lepus, which refers to the constellation just below there. So it's plausible that there is some correlation with the visual observation of the Orion constellation and the iconographic positions. And it's also interesting that if you look at the Flemsteed Atlas of Celeste, of the 1776 CE, the star positions actually resemble a bit what you see in the Gangadhara image, in the way the leg is lifted up because Orion is a hunter. So these are very old ideas across cultures of linking the hunter with Rudra and Shiva and so on. And it's also quite beautiful when you see that there is a verse of Appar in the 7th century where he says, Lord of the little chamber filled with honey will fill me with sky, Nilavu, and make me be. So this sense of being filled with sky is something which is also quite remarkable here. And in fact, the late Ganapati Sapati had also mentioned that the Nataraja image must be visualized within the 6 white stars that surround the red star Thiruvadurai or Alpha Orionis. Well, I'll also come to another part of the analysis, which is, of course, interesting. So one of the images that was fingerprinted to what I would say is the later Pandyan period, 13th century, was of Karaikal Ammayar, who is the 6th century Tamil poet saint. And she is said to have actually hailed from a merchant family in the coastal port town of Karaikal. And of course, when we look at, as I had shown earlier, one of the Pallava Vishnu images, that form also travels in a way to Southeast Asia with the movement of the Pallava Grantha script, and so on to Cambodia and the Cham region, and that also inspires the other scripts in that part of Southeast Asia, the Pallava Grantha script. But you also see that form of the Pallava Vishnu, some similar aspects you also see in the Khmer Vishnus and so on. The standing Vishnu, very imposing and majestic sort of form, standing in Samapada, as it were. But a very interesting aspect is that not only did, of course, the Nataraja image that you see in the Khmer context is more like what you saw in Badami with the Chatura Tandava and so on. But Karaikal Ammayar has also traveled there. And you see here that she's playing the cymbals and so on. And there is also a Sembian Mahadevi period Karaikal Ammayar from Thiruvelangadu. Of course, this has been commented by other scholars, but I had the opportunity to analyze this rather beautiful image from the Victor and Albert Museum. And it was found to have 20% lead and 3% tin. And you also see the Karaikal Ammayar depiction on a 10th century Chola temple, such as Nageshwaram and so on, and in Gangai Kondashwarapuram as well, which also correlates quite well to the Khmer form and also what was formalized under the Sembian Mahadevi period. But what is interesting also about this image, which is of the later Pandyan period, as I call it, is that she has these fangs, which is very distinctly shown in the Southeast Asian or the Cambodian version, the fangs, and with a very prominent protruding ribs and so on. So there seem to have these connections back and forth and so on. And another image which also fitted that later Pandyan period was this hollow cast hanging lamp, which is also in the Victor and Albert Museum, which was also fingerprinted to the later Pandyan period. And that had 7% zinc and 18% lead and 5% tin. Now, and of course, that was supposedly found in Ceylon, but it actually fits the trends for the later Pandyan period bronzes in terms of the copper sources and so on. And although there have been some analysis of metalwork in Sri Lanka, obviously this comparison would be important. But from what I've seen, it does not actually fit the Sri Lankan trend. So though it was found there, it seems to have been a Tamil image. And again, it's quite interesting that it's a bit similar, very spindly figure like this Karaikal Ammayar image. And again, you also see the fangs in the Hanuman, which is another aspect that you do see in some of the Southeast Asian images. Now, this being brass, I should also say that there is an inscription of Rajaraja Chola's time which says that pittale or brass was used for making lamps and so on. And you do see some workshops also following that of the Kamarar and so on for making lamps. And there was also a vase that I had studied from the Thanjavur Art Gallery, which you're looking at, a very beautiful one, which was also found to be of brass, 4% zinc and 13% lead, 6% tin of the later Chalukya Chola period. And so I'm making the point here that some of these ancillary parts like lamps and vases and so on do seem to have been made more of brass, whereas the main images were mainly of bronze at that time, as you can see. And there's another example here from the Krishna Delta, an Andhra brass oil lamp vessel, which also had 13% zinc and 8% lead, 11% tin. And that also very closely matched that the lead acid ratios of the Deccan zinc ingot that I had pointed out to you with the Brahmi inscription. So that zinc seems to have been used to make this type of octagonal vessel from the Krishna Delta, which is now in the British Museum. So I think this is my final slide, and I've probably used up all my time now. So I just wanted to point to the aspect of the tin. Of course, I'd also mentioned that, of course, there are old workings in Tamil Nadu, in Mamdur, and in Agni-Gundala, and several others which I have been visiting, which I had visited. But also in Karnataka, you have one, this old copper mine in Ingaldal, which has also had some carbon dates which have corresponded to early historic Shatavahana period and so on, but I won't go into that too much. But there were also some slags which I had uncovered in the Kalyadi region of the Hassan district, and the analysis of those slag specimens also revealed some remnants of bronze in them, bronze with about 7% tin. And why that was interesting is also that these slags seem to relate not to the alloying of copper and tin as discrete copper and tin, but it seems to have been a process of co-smelting copper and tin ores. And there's also some metallic iron being found in the slags, which suggests that very high temperature processes were used, and hence you had the iron ore flux and so on, or iron ore which was there as impurities and so on, getting into a sort of molten state, resulting in these iron globules and so on. So that suggests, though, that it was a co-smelting process and not an alloying, lower temperature alloying process. And why that was also significant is also the nickel-cobalt ratios of the metal content in these slags also seem to be similar to what I was getting in the Chola, the high Chola or Vijayala Chola pieces, which also had an average of about 7% tin. So, of course, it's just a speculation at this point, but it's a possibility that there could have been some local tin sources which could have been used, which we can't rule out. Though, of course, given the fact that there were these connections between the Cholas and Southeast Asia, which are, of course, well documented. For instance, at Nagapattinam, there was Rajaraja had invited the Sailendra king from Srivijaya to set up a Buddhist monastery, and a lot of the images which were subsequently found of Buddhas and so on are buried hoards associated with this monastery, which was pulled down by the Jesuits much later and so on. And of course, Southeast Asia has a lot of tin, also Malaysia and so on. And from about the 10th century, you do have Arab records of the tin trade from Southeast Asia and Malacca and so on. And Kedah is also another well-known site which is mentioned also in Chola inscriptions. So perhaps from later periods, they could have also been, of course, getting tin from Southeast Asia. And even in the memory of the artisans, such as at Nacharkoil, he did mention to me that, according to lore, the Kamalar who's making these bells in Nacharkoil, the tin was coming from Malaysia and so on. Though, of course, there's a completely different study which I've also done of the earlier bronzes, the megalithic bronzes, and also come to the conclusion that they were not shared sources, so they may well have been other local sources. There's a lot more to unpack about all this, and I think I should conclude over there. And these are some of the publications. And many thanks to all the people who have been with me on this journey, the curators of various museums and scholars and so on. The list is too long to go into, and people in the Geological Survey. And of course, the craftspeople family of Devasena Sthapati and Mohan Raj Sthapati and others. And thank you all for this opportunity.
Thank you, Sharada Srinivasan and Dr. Thomas Levy. Thank you very much for those very interesting and informative lectures.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a few doubts, questions, queries, whichever is appropriate. Give me a second, please. Dr. Levy, a question to you. You had mentioned about the bronze casters in Swami Malai. How many years would an individual spend learning this craft, this art?
before he turns into a professional?
That's a really good question. First, I'd like to say what an honor it is for me to be here with Professor Sharada. I haven't actually spoken to her before in person, and now it's virtually. So this is great, and it's great to be with you, Dr. Chithra, because your student became my student, Sarpanika Balaswaminathan. So it's great to meet both of you. My impression, and I don't have the data on this, and I'm not, I don't purport to be an expert on this topic. I did this study 13 years ago, and my area of interest and specialization is really the Middle East. But just from speaking with the Stapati community, the sons grow, they grow with this specialization, and I didn't, in the period that I was there, I did not actually see the sons of our three Stapati brothers engaged in the craft. They were too young, but maybe Sharada knows that, you know, the age trajectory on this.
Dr. Sharada, would you happen to know how long it would take to train a person to become a professional Stapati?
Yeah, well, it's a well, first of all, let me say also what a pleasure it is to finally meet Dr. Levy, though virtually, and also you, Chithra. So that's a wonderful session. Well, yes. Well, you know, one thing though is that as Dr. Levy would know better, there is a certain division of labor even within the sets of different activities that the different members of the Stapati family do, such as the senior member does more of the finer details of the wax modeling. The less senior member may do more of the rougher polishing, and then these days, for example, the filing and polishing and all that, they also hire other people from, you know, so there's a lot of different layers of the way this goes on. So I think it is also specific tasks which they do, and then some of them it's lifelong, really, I guess. So they're you know, at doing it, and they're still doing it at in a very advanced age and so on. But well, these are all, I think, the nuances which, you know, sometimes it seems like too much of an intrusion into their privacy to probe too much. You know, you ask some things and then you know, so I think there's a lot more there to learn. But I would say that and of course now what's happening with their younger generation is also they also want to follow IT and this and that. So it's not an easy craft. Many of them are moving away, and also there's just so few of them. But I would say that it certainly, you know, goes on into adolescence, and they do start, you know, quite young and so on. You know.
Yeah, and we shouldn't forget that there's the non-Stapati, non-hereditary community engaged in this craft, and they learn like after Indian independence, the government set up a school called the Pumbahar in Swami Malai, where they wanted to bring other people into the craft. And obviously it had been, you know, like metallurgy in many communities is somewhat secretive, you know, the recipes and the methods, but they wanted, the government, after independence, they wanted to involve more people, give more people opportunities to learn the craft. And I think it's like about a 5-year period that they could learn all the different steps in the Chaîne à Potoir.
Dr. Sharada, you have interacted closely with the Sthapatis of Swami Malai and perhaps some other places also. And we understand that they are following the same techniques as their ancestors were. But between these different schools of Sthapatis that we have now, are there any differences in technique?
Yeah, well, certainly when, for instance, when you go from one family to another, like they were saying, I mean, you have to understand these are still trade secrets to some extent, but then from what you gather, for instance, the Devasena Sthapati family are very particular to tell you that the melody that they use is very special. The kind of wax, the special wax that they have prepared is something very different, and it has that very lovely kind of color and so on. And so they have a certain speciality there which lends something to their skills, which is, it's, if you do go to some other studios, you'll see that they're doing a darker shade of wax even just down the road and so on. So they do have their nuances, and of course some of them are more traditional about using the odiole or the palm leaf frond for the measurements. Some others have moved to some other kinds of using scale measurements and things like that. And there are also Sthapatis who still survive, for instance in Karnataka, who follow slightly different their own means of measuring and their own understanding of the alloys they use. So I think there's still a lot to be unpacked over there and so on. And I think also the way they adapt to change. And I was also quite fascinated. I wanted to ask Dr. Levy while he's here, because I think he also did an interesting experiment of getting the Swami Malai Sthapatis to cast the Levantian bronzes, which are really some of the earliest lost wax castings. And I wondered if you could share some light on that, and the whole idea of the Levant and the Swami Malai tradition and so on.
As an outsider, like my area of deep connection is with the Southern Levant, and so it's always kind of risky when you get you move to another area, especially an area culturally rich, a heritage as Tamil Nadu. And your lecture was beautiful in highlighting all those different connections, Sharada.
Thank you.
It's always been a question in the Southern Levant how the earliest copper hoards were produced. And we knew it was the lost wax method, but it hadn't been, especially in the pre-internet era, it wasn't really well documented. And that's why it seems almost simple, but the Sthapati tradition of the lost wax method, it's, as you pointed out, it goes well before the Chola period and so on. So it provides a great parallel for our research of what's called the Cave of the Treasure hoard found in the Judean desert of Israel, which dates to about 6,000 years ago. But these are beautifully crafted objects, which are an alloy of copper and antimony and so on. And there's been no evidence of where they were actually produced. So we learned many things from Swami Malai. The fact that the molds themselves are smashed up, with hammers, and so they disappear from the archaeological record. And
absolutely,
so what we're always interested in is trying to move from the static archaeological record to the dynamics of the culture. And the experience of working with the Swami Malai community of bronze casters, it does that. It just opens it all up. So in the case of our work, I didn't go there to do that experiment, but being a Near Eastern archaeologist, I kept in my back pocket photocopies of my favorite chalcolithic metal objects. And so I humbly asked Radhakrishna at the end of my stay, like 2 days before we were going to leave, do you think you could do this? And, you know, he looked at it and he goes, that's easy, you know. And and we document that, and we put it in the book. And I want to say again that this book is co-authored with the three brothers, because this is their story. It's not ours. And it was just a great honor to be able to work together with them.
It's very nice, Dr. Levy. And I'd also like to tell the audience that Dr. Levy has been joining us for the lectures over the last 3 days. It's very early in the morning for him, where he stays in the US, and all credit to him for taking the trouble to get up so early and join us every day. Thank you, Professor.
I'm learning a lot. This is a wonderful opportunity. And if I've stepped on anybody's toes, I apologize. But again, bear with me.
Not at all. So one more question to you, sir. You had shown us a very interesting photograph of some of the tools used by the Sthapatis today. Are we aware that these were some of the same tools, the types of tools that were used in the past? Are they clearly following the same tradition set by their ancestors, or have they innovated in the modern times?
I'm only going to guess this because, to my knowledge, there hasn't been an excavation, and Sharada, you can tell me, the actual excavation of a Chola workshop. You know, we find these hordes of beautiful icons that have been hidden away, and then from invaders and so on, and then, but that's what we have. And so I assume that the basic range of tools would have been used, and the tools I showed you, most of them are made of iron and so on, but I'd like to hear what Sharada says about the workshops from the Chola period.
Well, I think that's a very good question, and an important question in a way, because first of all, I think, you know, so much of archaeology, still the resources are going into the earlier periods and so on. We don't have that much of medieval archaeology. And at Gangaikonda-Shorapuram, of course, some excavations were done. And what they did find, of course, were iron nails and things like that. But really not much of workshop evidence. At least in the earlier periods, you do get a few iron smelting furnaces and crucibles and that kind of thing. But, you know, related also to steel making, which I've been working on. But from this sort of period, really, it's not that easy. And I think it's also because, you know, the whole process itself is very, you know, the idea of sustainability was also in a way quite deeply embedded, because as Dr. Levy was pointing out also, the molds are all destroyed and then all reused. And, you know, there's an elaborate process of recollection and reuse and remelting every bit of scrap and so on. And I think likewise for the iron tools, once they go blunt, they just get resharpened and refashioned into something else and so on. So probably the tools that they have, you know, if one, you know, needs to, it's great that they were documented in that very elaborate fashion in the book, but I think people also need to collect some of them and study some of them. For instance, we did manage to get a bit of a anvil from one of the blacksmiths and all that, and that turned to be high carbon steel. It was wood steel, a bit of it that was used. So of course that was just you know, a blacksmith who was in fact doing one of the roadside patarai somewhere outside Bangalore. So I think there's so much to be documented before it's lost, but then a lot of the times, because then it just goes into scrap, and the craftspeople don't really have a sense of, I think this is part of the tradition, right, that everything is so transient in a way, and it makes a lot of sense because you don't build waste and everything. You know, in a way, what happens in the Western model of collecting antiquities, everything, but in a way you're collecting junk in one sense. You know, you're just cluttering up. But here the craftspeople, they're not really they're quite detached. They may make something for a client and this and that, and that's it. They're not really collecting things that their ancestors have made, or some of them have that emotion, but quite a lot of time there aren't those kinds of trajectories. But I think we need to look at it a bit more and study it, and I think the experimental approach that Professor has been following is also wonderful. Getting to look at how they were made. Again,
yeah, and there are some objects like the crucibles, for example, probably made of clay during the Chola period, and today they use graphite from Andhra. So, and that's a whole industry in itself. So these things do change, but the underlying processes or processual meanings are carried through time, I think.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Sharada, you had mentioned that there was a shift in iconometry from the Chola to the Vijayanagara times with regard to some Rama images. Would you know if that was true of those of other deities as well?
Yeah, that's a good question, of course. It seems also that it seems very marked in the case of the Rama images, and the other ones I couldn't particularly, let's say, detect it in quite the same way. But I guess haven't also done it across board. It was more, see, in some, like for instance, but that is a good question, and I think that will also help to kind of look back and see whether that is the case or not. But for instance, the Lakshmi Narasimha image in Hampi, you see that there's a very consistent use of the Panchatala for the Lakshmi Narasimha across Hampi. So it could be that it's at a particular dynastic period that you have a certain kind of tala formation and so on. So this was actually a preliminary study because we had started this digital Hampi, studies. But it could well be that and yes, in the Parvati images, you do see some that too, that some are Ashtatala and some move to Dashatala, that could be. But it seemed rather marked in the case, particularly of the Rama images, more than you see in the other images. So that's why that set me thinking about whether that had, a significance also in terms of the cultic significance or the worship practice and so on. Yeah.
And we do know that the Vijayanagara rulers emphasized on Rama worship, especially since their capital was the ancient Kishkinda of the Valmiki Ramayana fame.
Yes.
Dr. Levy, one question to you, please. I know we are running out of time. You had mentioned that in the Chola times, there was a combination of gold, silver, copper, zinc, and tin as the alloy. And you had mentioned that perhaps the same composition is not used in the making of the bronze images today. So what would be the alloy that is now generally in use?
Well, again, Sharada is the expert. She does the analysis. She actually does the metallurgical analyses, and I think it's three metals today are the main ones: copper, zinc, and what else? Sharada, would you add to that recipe?
Lead, I would say, but you're right that it's more of a brassy alloy that they use today, and that's also because it's more ductile. They can work it more. They seem to sort of work quite a lot and so on. Yeah.
And the question comes up where they get the metal today, and a lot of it is collected from homes. They go around and collect kitchenwares, the older brass and so on, and then they'll actually
so much recycling.
They'll give them they'll give a family a whole brand new aluminum set in exchange. And this goes back, this goes back to that observation about seeing the importance of recycling in the workshop. And we know about that even in the Chola period, when there was connectivity with Arabia, and we have texts from Jewish traders actually living throughout Arabia that have been found in Cairo in a synagogue. It's called the Cairo Geniza, and there are many letters. There's over 100 letters from these traders, Jewish traders, going to Tamil Nadu, bringing scrap metal. This is an old Jewish occupation, the scrap metal trade. And they were bringing the metals to be melted down and used in the crafting of the idols. And I wondered, and I wanted to ask Sharada how this mixing might influence the studies of lead isotope and so on that you've carried out admirably.
Mm. Yes, absolutely. You see, I think that this aspect of the recycling is also very specific to the vessels and things like that, because also, like you mentioned, the Geniza documents, you have that in the Malabar also, the similar Geniza documents, and, the great Tunisian Jew who also married a lady from the Tulu coast. And then they had this bronze, workshop. So this was, I guess, going on. But the interesting thing with the images, which is probably different from what is happening today, is that kind of clustering actually suggests to me that at least in the images, they were using primary metal, because otherwise those lead isotope ratios of so many could not just cluster like that. You do see some examples of the recycling. I won't say that it's not there, because there are some examples of an image where it looks very clearly like a late image, but it has let's say the lead isotope ratio trends fitting the Chola period, and it makes me think that that's a recycled image of a later period. And even that Kanchipuram Buddha that I showed you, the fact that it had lead isotope ratios which fitted a Western Indian source, and the Western Indian images are most often Jaina. So I'm just wondering, now is that a Jain image that is recycled to a Buddhist image? So clearly, but you don't see the kind of spread in the lead isotope ratios that you, for instance, see in Mediterranean coins. Quite often you just find that they're all over the place because there's so much of mixing going on. So that kind of thing you don't see that much, at least in these particular South Indian bronzes, which lends me to think that there could have been more of use of primary metal and so on. So, but I think it's still a very interesting and open kind of, and thank you again for bringing up the Geniza documents, which I hadn't realized there was such a close connection with the Tamil, at least. Of course, you do see that in the text, but the fact that they actually went around collecting scrap, and that still happens, as you say. And that's also why we actually perhaps don't have as many images in the record as we should do, or we could do, and so on. So that's, and also it's a big matter of concern, because every time I go, it's just heartbreaking to see some really nice piece of object is just about to be consigned to the flames. But at another level, I guess it's sustainable. They're not creating junk. So
yeah.
And so on. Yeah. And Dr. Levy, also wanted to ask you about the very interesting community that you documented, and I, of course, haven't been able to find that much information on them. The Manala Subhavas, the one who are cleaning the mud and retrieving metal from even very trace casting debris and things like that. Would you like to throw some light on that as well, and so on?
I will, but I think they want to ask some questions from the audience.
From the audience, yes. Okay.
I'll be happy to go. I love the mud cleaner. So
yeah.
If you could, Dr. Levy, in just a few minutes, then we can take just perhaps one or two questions. Very briefly.
So sometimes to me, the main contributions of the book is actually all about the recycling. That's a new kind of story, and it was just fortuitous that we spent many days and nights in the workshop, the manufactory, And just one day, I walked out in the back of the yard, and there was a man who had dug a large pit and put in a brick platform next to it, and he was very busy, as I showed in the lecture, retrieving the metalliferous sediment and materials from the shop floor where all the workings had taken place. And this man was a Catholic, and his father and grandfather were in that business. But his son, when I asked him, is this going to continue? He said, my son actually wants to become a bronze caster and go to the Pumbahar, the school. So everybody, I think everybody that does a traditional craft today is concerned and wonders, what about the future generation? You know, because, and this is something I asked Ashwin, who is helping to organize this, to give a call to the Stapati brothers, but so that they could join us today, but they're at a wedding or something, and but they, I would love to know whether you know, Radhakrishna's son is becoming a bronze caster, you know, craftsman. That's what we need to find out, and we need to, as we heard in your lecture, Chithra, or your comments yesterday about the importance of Tamil heritage and history and archaeology and getting the young people interested. You know, how are we going to do it? How can we, with our interests in archaeometallurgy and ethnoarchaeology, how can we contribute?
We really need to bring the young people in, whether it's as an audience or heritage enthusiasts or bronze sculptors. We need to bring the next generation in. Maybe just
I think
one...
you have a lot of energy, Chithra. I see you giving, you know, so many talks and everything. I think I would be flat out if I was following such a, you know, punishing schedule. But yeah, that's great.
Thank you, Dr. Sharada. Thank you. Maybe just one question from the audience, as we are very quickly running out of time. And this is to Dr. Sharada, I think. Madam, did you come across any references to metal composition ratio details, either in inscriptions or agamic and Shilpa Shastra texts?
Metal composition ratios, did she say?
In inscription.
Well, in the sense that, of course, some of the Shilpa texts do mention, you know, Ashtadhatu and Panchaloha and so on. But, and there are varying reports on what these refer to, because some will say that there is also iron added as a trace, and then Ashtadhatu, there are, you know, different versions of that, you know, going back to Charaka Samhita and then also in the Shilpa text and all that. But when you actually analyze it, at least the Ashtadhatu, for instance, with the North Indian images, you know, again, you hear that these are Ashtadhatu, but when you actually analyze it, it's not practical to have a bronze with 8 elements added in that sense. And even if they were, it would have just been some traces, as I said, more for the ritual purpose. For instance, I saw Devasena when in 1990 when Digvijay and I had gone there. So then we said we want a Panchaloha image cast. So then he told us to go and just buy a few tolas of gold or silver. It was like 1 tola gold, 1 tola silver, and then we melted it in a little ladle, and then it was poured at the very end into this bronze cast. So it wouldn't even be, you know, more than 1% of the total casting. So even if you did an analysis, you wouldn't detect these minor traces and so on, which would have, as I said, been more for the Shastric purpose. But of course, there's a lot more to be done in terms of the text and the agamas. And I guess we have our hands full even just doing the scientific analysis, which is not a trivial matter either, and interpreting and publishing and staying afloat and getting funds and so on. So, you know, one doesn't have the luxury to do absolutely everything. And Yeah. And also, Dr. Levy, my best to Saparnika as well, who used to, I've been to Swami Malay as well with her, and some fond memories of.
Yeah. I would just like to give one more plug. This book is free on the internet, and I loved Vikram's deck of cards for cultural heritage in India, and these are the tools we need to push out to make people interested in cultural heritage.
So, thank you so much, Dr. Thomas Levy and Dr. Sharada Srinivasan. It was a pleasure having you with us and to have you share your immense knowledge and years of research with us. And on behalf of Tamil Heritage Trust and on behalf of the very large audience that are listening to you, thank you ever so much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity, and look forward to being in touch with you more, Dr. Levy and Chithra. So thank you, and all the very best to all our colleagues at Tamil Heritage. This is an excellent job. And I see that there are a lot of very fascinating and interesting comments, but, look forward to being in touch with, and thank you for the interest and so on.
Thank you so much.